Hello everyone, Nikhil this side from Coding Beam. So in this video, we will learn about the useReducer hook in the React. So what exactly is the useReducer hook? So about the useReducer hook, they are used for the complex state management which stores and updates the states just like the useState hook, but it's quite complex to manage the state with it. And they are quite similar to the Redux reducers if you have learned the Redux, and it accepts the reducer function as its first parameter, and the second parameter is the initial state, and it exactly returns two array elements which holds the state value. The first is the state and the second value is a dispatch, which is a function which dispatches an action which triggers an action in which the state is updated. So the state is a variable which first holds the initial state and then it holds the updated state. So the state contains the state of the application, and the dispatch is a function which triggers an action of the object with two properties, the type and the payload. The type contains a unique type in it and the payload contains a data. And then the reducer function is the function which receives the action from the dispatch and it manages and updates the state. So this is the concept of the useReducer hook in the React. So useReducer contains first the reducer function and an object which contains a default and an empty value first, and it contains a reducer function and the initial state, and the reducer function receives the states from the action and then it manages and returns the newly updated state, and the states get the initial state first and then receives the updated state from the reducer function, and the newly updated state is stored in the state variable, which we have the state variable here. So this is the concept of the useReducer in the React. So let's see how we can demonstrate the useReducer hook with an example of the form handling. And now we are in the Visual Studio Code, and now we have to first import the useReducer from the React. So we have to import the useReducer, and then now we have to declare the useReducer as per the syntax. So first we have to declare the const, and the array will contain exactly two elements and it will be destructuring an array. So first it will contain the state and then it will contain a dispatch which will contain a function, and then it will be equals to the useReducer which we have imported. And first you can see it contains a reducer function, so it will be the reducer, and the second it will contain an initial arguments or the initial state. And for the initial state, if I will define here an object, and the object can contain like the name property, and the name will be equals to again and the object, and it will be a nested object, and it will contain a value field in the name, and we can declare some more fields in an object, but now we are only declaring the value. And the first it will contain an empty value, and second it will contain as the email. So our form will contain a name and the email field in it. So then email will contain the same as an object, and object will contain a value as the property as an empty string. Now this is a useReducer we have now defined, and now we have to just return the reducer. Now in the div it will contain a form. So it will contain a form, and the form will contain first input fields, input, type will be equals to the text as of now, and then it will contain a value field. The initial value will contain the value, and we have to send the initial value from the state. So the state, so this initial value will go to the state variable first. So this state variable dot name dot value. So the state variable contains a name field and the name contain a value. So the initial state will contain the name state dot name dot value, and then we have to define the onChange. So whenever the onChange event will happen in that, so we will now declare a callback function here, and the callback function will contain a dispatch function here, and first it will contain an event as the parameter, and then we have now to dispatch the action. So here it will contain a dispatch, and dispatch will contain two properties of the action, and we have to dispatch an action. Now the two properties contains the type and the value as a payload. So first it will contain a type, and then type will be a unique for everything, like this is a name field, so it will contain like a name, and then it will contain a value. So I will give the value as a property of the payload, and the payload will contain the value of the input field which is now changing every time. So on change input is now changing every time whenever we type in the input field. So e.target.value. So event.target.value will give us the value of the current input, and then it will be dispatched to the reducer function, and we will create a reducer function within a moment, and then it will manage the state there. So now we are sending an action with the dispatch from the input field, and now we have to receive the action in the reducer function. So I will close here the input now, and then I will create another input with that. This will contain a name, and now we have to do the same for the email also. So it will contain the email. So the email will contain now the input type equals to the email, and then it will contain the state.email.value, now email.value, and the onChange function will dispatch an event with the same, but now the type will be the unique and the type will be the email now. So now the type will be the email and the value will be the event.target.value, which we will send to the reducer function, and then it will contain a button to the form, and it will contain the submit. Here the type of the button also, type will be equals to the like submit, and then we have declared the type, and now we have to declare the onSubmit form to that. Like the onSubmit will contain a handler, and it will a submit handler. Submit handler function will contain a submitted event in it, and then we have to declare the submit handler const submit handler, and it will contain an event as the parameter, and then we have to declare the function. And now first we have to declare here the reducer function to manage the state, and then we can declare the reducer function before the component function because it will be re-rendered whenever the state will get there. So then we have to declare the reducer function const reducer, and it will contain the two parameters, and the first it will contain the state, and the state will contain the previous state, and then we have to add another parameter, and it will be the action. As we are dispatching the action from the dispatch function, so it will contain the action, and the action will contain the two properties of that, and the first it will contain the type, and it will contain the payload, and then we have to use here the state and the action as the parameters, and we have to declare the function. So it will be the function, and now we have to check the type of it, and then we have to update the state of that type. And first the name contains the type as the name, so I will check the name from the switch function. Like the switch statement will contain the action dot type, and the action dot type will contain a string value, and for that first it will contain the name, like the case of the name, and then it will just return. If I will now just return the value as like this, and first it will contain the previous state, and then the previous state, this is the spread operator which contains the previous state, and we are now returning first the previous state and the updated state, and we get the updated state from the action.payload. So the payload will contain the updated state every time whenever we receive that. So it will contain the name as an object again, and the name will contain an object again inside it, and the value property will be there like this, the name equals to the value, and then it will contain the value as the action.payload which contains an updated state. So this will be our return statement in that. So we are now returning the return, and it will contain the previous state of it, and then it will contain the updated state in it. So the return statement is now completed, and now we have to check for the another one. Like this time the case will be the email. So the email will be there, and then we have to use here the email. So the case will be the email here, and in the email case it will be the same return statement. So just return, and it will contain the previous state and then the updated state inside that. So the email, an object, and the value, and it will contain the action dot payload. So now we have to declare here the default case also, and for the default case it will just return the state. So the default case will return only the state object with that, and it will contain the previous state in that. So the state, and now we have to save, and now we have to check if everything is running, and we can also define the event.prevent default in the submit handler function. Like event.prevent default will prevent the default behavior of the forms in the JavaScript, and then we can now just console.log this state object in that. So the state will be now console.logged. So if I will now save and if I will now check the code that how it works in that, so now we have declared the reducer state and action parameters, and we are now checking the type. The case name will return this, and the email then will return this, and the default case will return the previous state only. And we have declared the state and dispatch, and the reducer function contains the function in that. Then we have declared the initial state with the name and the value properties in that. So in the console log, in the submit handler, we are now just consoling the state object, and in the forms we have now declared the value of the state.name.value. So every time the value will be updated from the dispatch function from the reducers, so it will get the updated state of the value in that. And for the email the same, and there is a button. So if I will now save and if I will now go to the Chrome to check this, so the name and email is there. So if I will check the console also, so the console will contain that. So the name, if I will declare the name as the Nikhil, and the email will contain as the Nikhil at the recording B. So if I will now submit it, so then you will see it will contain the state object, and the state object contains the name and the email as the properties, and the name field will contain the name which we have entered there, and the email will contain the same email which we have entered there. So now it is now working fine. So if I will now go to the code, and if I will now refactor the code like or this, if I will now just declare an initial state here except this, so I will just copy this and I will provide an initial state in it. And for the initial state, if I will declare the initial state before the component function, because it will be used only once, so const initial state will contain an object with the properties of the name and the email value. So the state now will contain an initial state in that, and we have now declared the reducer function, and also we can declare the dispatch function for every input field here like the name and the email. And we can also declare the handle change function to handle different type of events, like if we can declare here the dispatch, and we can send here the type of also like the name and the email. So the single dispatch function will be used for all the cases in that, and for that you need to create a new function like a handle change, and the handle change you have to use another switch statements in that, and the switch statement will now send the action to the reducer function according to their IDs. So this was about the reducer functions in that, and how to use the useReducer hook in the React. So thank you guys for watching the video, and I hope you will like the video, and guys please subscribe to our channel if you are new.